Hello and welcome to the Mountebank History of Scotland series, podcasts, whatever you want to call it. My name is Daniel Downey. I'm your host. I am a comedian based in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I am also a historian of Scottish history. I have a master's degree in Scottish history. And today's episode is all about the conventicles. These were illegal public gatherings of unvaccinated people that occurred 350 years before the pandemic was even a thing. After the Restoration government in Scotland introduced legislation that required all ministers appointed since 1649 to pledge their allegiance to the new King Charles II and the Restoration regime, many ministers refused, and instead they took their congregations out into the hills and fields of the Scottish countryside while their old churches were converted into Wetherspoons. These illegal religious public gatherings would become known as conventicles, and some of them could be absolutely massive. There'd be up to 14,000 people in attendance in a field, like an illegal rave, except not fun. In response, the Scottish government sent soldiers out into the wilderness of the Scottish countryside to find and violently break up these illegal religious gatherings. And thankfully, this would be the last time in British and Irish history that the government would ever send soldiers into communities to break up gatherings of people with religious and political beliefs that they did not agree with. Fee you. The Conventiclers, they responded by arming the members of the conventicle with clubs, pitchforks, scythes, and M16s, as was their Second Amendment right. Now, when the Archbishop of St Andrews, James Sharp, was brutally murdered by conventiclers in May 1679, the government stepped up its suppression of the conventicles in an attempt to hammer home the point that you do not fuck with the bishop fucks you. However, instead of breaking up the conventicles and finding the men responsible for Sharp's death, government dragoons, they were defeated in battle by a group of conventiclers in a spectacular and unexpected covenanting victory at the Battle of Drumclog in June 1679, a battle that continues to be celebrated by the victorious Protestants with drums and clogs to this day. Now, if this is the first time that you have listened or watched the Mountebank History of Scotland series, this is the sort of thing that you should expect. It's Scottish history with lots of Tory bashing and jokes about the royal family. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, maybe you can report me to your local councillor or MP. Anyway, without further ado, here is your episode all about the conventicles. I do hope you enjoy it. Have fun out there, and I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! In October 1661, the Scottish Commissioner to the Scottish Parliament for King Charles II, John Middleton, the Earl of Middleton, he gave Presbyterian ministers a month to comply with Scotland's new religious legislation, the Act of Presentation and Collection. Now, this act insisted that all ministers appointed to their parishes since 1649 had to sign a pledge of allegiance to King Charles II, had to denounce the National Covenant, and had to agree to have their appointment approved by the local laird and bishop of the local diocese. The result was that 260 ministers, most from the southwest of Scotland, left their parishes and they were replaced by king's curates. These were essentially yes men sent by the government to fill the vacant church positions. Now, the vacancies themselves were not necessarily an issue, but the heavy-handed nature of the legislation, it created a solid block of new covenanting support that exercised a lot of influence on the more moderate Presbyterian wing. Faced with this new body of king's curates, many local parishioners refused to accept their services, and instead they followed their former ministers into the fields and hillsides of the Scottish countryside in congregations known as conventicles. In 1663, non-church attendance was so severe that the government was forced to introduce an Act of Parliament which fined parishioners for non-attendance at the parish kirk, which was a real shiter, because when you go to church, you've got to pay money when that wee plate comes round. And then now, if you don't go to church, you also got to pay money as well. It's an expensive habit being a Protestant, and you don't even get any bread or wine for your money. Tensions between the displaced ministers, parishioners and the government were intensified by the Anglo-Dutch Wars of 1665 to 1667. The Dutch were the biggest buyers of Scotland's largest export, wool. And now that they were at war with the English, the Scots had not only lost their best customer, but they were also expected to provide soldiers to fight in said war. The English had completely fucked up our trading relationship with the Dutch, and they'd do it again in 2016, bless them. Worse still, the payment of troops to fight in the war came from the indemnity fines being paid for non-church attendance and the reimbursement of out-of-pocket royalists who had been fined and confiscated during the civil wars and the interregnum. So it's safe to say if Covenanting Presbyterians weren't pissed off before, they were becoming increasingly discontent. And there was a very real concern amongst those in government that the disaffected southwest of Scotland might seek to link up with the Dutch, and there could be a Dutch invasion of Britain launched from Scotland and led by Dick Advocat. And so, the illegal congregations being held by displaced Presbyterian ministers in the Scottish fields and hillsides were not only banned, but government dragoons were sent out into the hillsides to break up these illegal religious gatherings. Despite the fear of soldiers appearing and breaking up their meetings, the conventicles continued to grow, and outlawed field preachers became something akin to folk heroes. Ministers such as John Welch, John Blackadder, and Donald Cargill acquired legendary reputations as they moved around the countryside in disguise to preach at large open-air conventicles. The Reverend Alexander Pedden gained the nickname Prophet Pedden due to his uncanny ability to evade arrest and, of course, his pussy-grabbing abilities. Although, to be fair, ministers becoming legendary or acquiring legendary status is actually fairly common in Scotland. Like the minister at my school, Mr. McKeady, he gained legendary status when he was so hungover at a school assembly that he vomited right in the middle of it. What an absolute legend that guy was. And so, to counter the threat of interruption by armed dragoons, the conventiclers, they took up arms ready to defend their congregations like, teachers in American high schools. And as tensions continued to grow, confrontation between the conventiclers and the government was becoming more and more inevitable. And it would seem that a covenanting rebellion was just over the horizon. On the 13th of November 1666, 4 fugitive conventiclers were passing through the town of Dalry in Dumfriesshire when they came upon a group of soldiers who were beating up an old man for not paying a non-church attendance fine. The old man was in debt, and so he had to take a beating. He was like Mike Tyson boxing that YouTube laddie. Now, the men, seeing the old man being needlessly beaten, they rushed in to replace him with Kamala Harris. And after overpowering the soldiers and saving the old man, they then hurried to a conventicle at nearby Balmaclellan. When they were told of the needless beating of the old man, the members of the conventicle, they were riled into action. They marched on the garrison in Dumfries, took control of the town, and captured the town's dragoon commander, Sir James Turner, who was known to be keeping and embezzling fine payments for non-church attendment, as well as awarding phony PPE contracts to his Tory pals. After their success in Dumfriesshire, the conventiclers hoped to emulate their covenanting predecessors, the Whigamores, who had successfully marched on Edinburgh and taken control of the kingdom in 1648, in the famous Whigamore raid of Edinburgh, which we talked about a few episodes ago. Now, this latest march in the capital from the southwest of Scotland would become known as the Pentland Rising. The conventiclers, they swore their allegiance to both king and covenant and marched through Lanarkshire towards Edinburgh. As they struggled on through the miserable early Scottish winter, their numbers dwindled, and by the time they reached Edinburgh, they numbered less than 1,000. Now, if you are wondering why a group of less than 1,000, mostly farmers armed with pitchforks and scythes, thought that they could take the entire capital city of Edinburgh, what you have to remember about the people here, the people who live in Edinburgh, they are so scared of working class people from the west of Scotland. The conventiclers, they just assumed that they could take the entire city with only a handful of folk. The conventiclers, they were denied entry to the city or denied the opportunity to send a delegation to meet with the Privy Council south of Edinburgh via volunteer force who had gathered to protect the city. Dejected, the Conventiclers retreated into the Pentland Hills south of Edinburgh, and a government army of around 2,000 men, led by General Tam Dalyell, followed them into the Pentlands and scattered and killed around 50 Conventiclers in the Battle of Rullion Green, fought on the 28th of November 1666. Now, Dalyell, he was a dedicated royalist. He had fought at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, where he was captured, but he escaped his imprisonment in the Tower of London and fled to Russia, only returning to Scotland at the restoration of Charles II in 1660. Now, if the killing of the Conventiclers at the Battle of Rullion Green was deemed controversial, then the real controversy came in the fallout of the Pentland Rising. There were brutal and very public reprisals in the aftermath of the Pentland Rising, with around 30 Conventiclers being hanged in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dumfries and Ayr. The reprisals were so severe, in fact, that Dalyell briefly retired his commission in protest. The Pentland Rising was far too small scale to be considered a genuine rising, but there was fear in the government that something more substantial was in the pipeline. The brutal punishments handed out to those involved at Rullion Green was designed to detract any others from any further attempts on the government. However, by far and away, the government's biggest fear was the Dutch. The Second Dutch Wars of 1665 to 1667 were proving to be a disaster. In 1667, the Dutch fleet were able to sail up the Thames and tow away the King's flagship, the HMS Royal Charles, with apparent almost impunity. The King's ship in 1667 was as snatchable as a mobile phone in London. In 1667, England and the City of London was in no way, shape able to defend itself from the Dutch. In 1665, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague wiped out over 70,000 Londoners. And in 1666, the city was completely destroyed in the Great Fire of London. Plague, fire, war, famine. Londoners, they were just waiting for Boris Johnson, Mayor of London, as the final sign of the city's ultimate rapture. Amongst this disarray, England was also gripped by fears of a great Catholic revival. Anti-Catholic sentiment was pretty rife throughout the British Isles in the 17th century. Although please do not worry, because our good friends at the Orange Order, they have managed to keep it nice and updated for the 21st century, mostly through their belief that they are still living in the 17th century. The King's brother and heir apparent to the thrones, James, the Duke of York, the future James VII of Scotland and James II of England, he converted to Catholicism in 1672, and he took a Catholic wife in 1674, the Italian princess Mary of Modena. The King's brother being Catholic in 1672 was deemed more shocking than our current King's brother being a literal King Charles II's wife, Catherine of Braganza, was, as we discussed last week, also Catholic. And there was rumours that Charles himself had secretly converted to Catholicism in the 1670 Treaty of Dover, signed with Louis XIV of France in return for French support against the Dutch. This Catholic mania was then ramped up in 1678 when an Anglican priest named Titus Oates fabricated an entirely fictitious plot claiming that Catholic authorities in England were planning to assassinate the king. Titus Oates was talking complete and utter bollocks, but Titus knew that all he had to do was put his message on the side of a bus, and gullible old English people, they would gobble it up. Yum, yum, yum. Otis's entirely made-up popish plot would result in the execution of 35 Roman Catholics in England, and James, the Duke of York, having to temporarily flee to Holland in March 1679 for his safety. Holland at this time was a Protestant powerhouse led by its impressive ruler, William of Orange, who had successfully defended the Netherlands from the expansionist aims of the French king Louis XIV. And I mean, William, he really was impressive, because it's not everyone that can pull off Orange. Unless, of course, you're an old horse lady tugging off Prince Harry behind a pub. She definitely pulled off Orange. In 1677, William of Orange, he married Princess Mary, the 15-year-old daughter of James, the Duke of York. William of Orange, he married a 15-year-old lassie. Perhaps this is why Rangers fans are constantly singing about paedophilia at Ibrox. I don't know. Princess Mary's mother was Anne Hyde, James's first wife, the daughter of Charles II's most trusted advisor and minister, Edward Hyde. James, he had met Anne while she was working as a lady-in-waiting to his sister Mary, who was the Princess of Orange, who was William of Orange's mother and the widowed wife of King William II, William of Orange's father. This is all very confusing, but basically what it means is that James, Duke of York, the future James VII of Scotland and James II of England, was both William of Orange's uncle and his father-in-law. And Christmas dinner, it would be made even more awkward when William and Mary would usurp James's throne in the glorious revolution of 1688 and 1689. When James discovered that Anne was pregnant, they married in secret, but there was scandal over his marrying a commoner. Mary wasn't mixed race, though, so, the Daily Mail readers weren't as pissed off as they could have been. James, he insisted that the marriage be recognised, a decision that he probably regretted since it legitimised Mary's claim to the throne, and it was through his eldest daughter, Mary, that William of Orange would usurp James's throne. James's decision to recognise his eldest child's legitimacy would ultimately ruin him. Presumably, this is why Boris Johnson doesn't recognise any of his children, although it should be noted that both he and James were perfectly capable of ruining their own political careers. In 1667, Charles II's Scottish commissioner, the Earl of Middleton, was ousted in a power struggle with his great rival John Maitland, the Earl of Lauderdale. Middleton, he was sent to Tangier to become governor, while Lauderdale became the essential viceroy in Scotland, and he ruled Scotland on Charles II's behalf for the majority of the 1670s. Lauderdale, raised to a duke in 1672, was assisted by key members of the Privy Council in Scotland, the Earl of Tweedale, the Earl of Kincardine, and Sir Robert Murray, a Scottish statesman, army general, and diplomat who was Lauderdale's former associate in Whitehall in London. These men, they were intelligent, decent-minded, and all were moderate Presbyterians who had opposed the reintroduction of Episcopalianism in Scotland. But regardless of how they felt about Charles II's religious reforms, all of them believed, like most of the nobility in Scotland at this time and most ambitious men of substance, they believed that their careers, their futures were dependent on an exaggerated royalism and dedication to the new regime. With these men in charge, Scotland would experience a welcome decade of effective government after the war-torn economy of the Civil War era and the excessive taxation and the military occupation of the Cromwellian interregnum. In the 1670s, markets were licensed outside of the traditional royal boroughs, and towns like Falkirk and Bo'ness, which were not royal boroughs, they began to flourish. The 1670s also saw the beginnings of the lucrative Glasgow tobacco trade, which would be so important to the city. The Glasgow tobacco trade basically involved Glaswegians going to Tenerife and returning with 20 packets of duty-free Camels. However, despite their best efforts, Lauderdale and his associates, they were hampered by the 17th century navigation laws, which prohibited the Scots from trading with English colonies. After the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland ended and the individual kingdoms were re-established, customs barriers with England were once again put in place, which meant that the world Scotland could trade with was narrowing. Protective English and French trade tariffs hurt the kingdom, and Scotland was simply too small and insignificant for either nation to bother offering more favourable trade terms. So basically, in the 1670s, there was fairly good government and a stale economy. Fairly good government and a stale economy. This could, honest to God, easily be the title of the next SNP manifesto. The trade tariffs and a stagnant economy wasn't the only problem that Lauderdale was facing in Scotland. The chain of Cromwellian fortresses that had been built during the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland to control the country militarily, they remained in place in Scotland. These fortresses, until they could be dismantled, they couldn't be left empty in case they were taken over by potential troublemakers. And so until they could be dismantled, they remained occupied by English troops, to the great displeasure of most of the Scottish population, who felt that despite the end of the Cromwellian incorporation, the military occupation of Scotland, they remained under English military occupation. And so despite Lauderdale's good governance, Scotland in the 1670s had a stale economy, and English troops remained in the country. This, coupled with the Catholic panic in England and the growing strength of William of Orange on the continent, meant fears of a Dutch-backed rebellion in Scotland remained, and the conventicles, they continued to grow. Such was the fear of potential uprising in Scotland. The government set about a process of measured reconciliation with the conventiclers known as the accommodation. In June 1669, Lauderdale, he carried out an indulgence, and 42 ministers who had refused to adhere to the Acts of Church Uniformity in Scotland were allowed to return to their parishes if they signed a bond of good behaviour. Bond of good behaviour. It sounds like the shitest Bond film of all time, doesn't it? Lauderdale, he carried out a second indulgence in 1672, in which a further 90 ministers were restored to their parishes. There were reprisals for those ministers who did not work with the government. Unlicensed ministers, or ministers who continued to hold illegal congregations, they were fined or transported to the colonies, and field preaching would eventually become a capital offence. But on the whole, the government's approach in the 1670s was very much to try and reconcile and work with dissident Presbyterians. However, despite the indulgences, there were many in Scotland who continued to refuse or accept any concessions from the state. They had no intention of compromising, or no surrender, as they would put it. Reconciliation, it was a nigh-on impossibility for protesting, hardline, covenanting Presbyterians, because for the strictest Presbyterians who adhered stringently to the 1638 National Covenant and the 1643 Solemn League, the covenant, it was a bond with God, and as such they were, like the American Republican Party, mortgaged to extremism. A bargain with God, it simply couldn't be cast off for the sake of unity and peace, regardless of what Lauderdale had to offer or his apparent good intentions. For the most unrelenting Presbyterians, Scotland, and by extension of the Solemn League and Covenant, England and Ireland, simply must be Presbyterian. And so, despite this period of accommodation in the 1670s, the conventicles, they spread further and further into the heartlands of Scotland, and as they did so, they grew in size. By the late 1670s, large-scale conventicles were being staged with impunity and with little attempt at secrecy. At one conventicle at Skia Hill near Dumfries in 1678, there were over 14,000 conventiclers in attendance. With armed bands of over 10,000 conventiclers moving around the countryside like an army, and a potential link-up with the Dutch, Lauderdale, he abandoned his policy of reconciliation with the Presbyterians, and a conventicler prison, it was established on the Bass Rock in the Firth of Forth, like a kind of Presbyterian Alcatraz. There was even a suggested conventicler internment camp in the Northern Isles, although it never turned out to be a thing. In fact, it would be to the Western Isles where the most extreme Protestants would end up. One of Lauderdale's most important allies was Archibald Campbell, the Earl of Argyll, the royalist supporting son of the famed Covenanting martyr and Covenanting hero, the Marquess of Argyll. Archibald Campbell, he had been allowed to succeed his father to the earldom, but not the marquessate, meaning that his father was the first and the only Marquess of Argyll that has ever been in Scotland. Although both Lauderdale and Argyll were royalist Presbyterians, they were an unlikely match. Lauderdale, he was an opportunist and exaggerated royalist, whereas Argyll, he was the son of a legendary, committed, covenanting leader and martyr. In 1677, Lauderdale, he invited 8,000 Highlanders to move covenanting hotspots of the southwest of Scotland with an open invitation from the government to loot. An open invitation from the government to loot in Scotland. Michelle Mone's ancestors were the first to pick up on it. The Highlanders that Lauderdale invited south, they didn't come from the traditional Gaelic heartlands in the far west of the Highlands, but from the southern Highlands, from estates such as Argyll's. Argyll, he was instructed to suppress the Conventiclers on his land, which he did, but he did so reluctantly. The change of tact from Lauderdale from accommodation to suppression, it didn't have the desired effect. Lauderdale, he had hoped that the Conventiclers would learn their lesson after this kind of looting and pillaging by the Highlanders, but tensions remained, and rebellion, it was now closer than ever. Argyll, he would eventually follow in his father's footsteps and become a covenanting martyr when, like his father, he was executed by means of the Maiden in Edinburgh in 1685 for leading an unsuccessful covenanting invasion of Scotland from Holland. But we'll talk about this in a couple of episodes down the line. For Lauderdale, neither accommodation nor suppression of the conventicles had worked, and by the end of the 1670s, he was in failing health and he was rapidly losing control of the kingdom. In 1679, he suffered a stroke, and in 1680, he formally retired before his death in 1682. Without Lauderdale, Scotland was left with a power vacuum, and the country became increasingly unstable when into this powder keg came the shocking and brutal assassination of Scotland's highest-ranking member of the church, Archbishop James Sharp. An unsuccessful attempt on Sharp's life had already been made in Edinburgh in 1688 when Archbishop Sharp, he stepped into his carriage on the top of Blackfriars Wynd in the city when a poisoned bullet intended for him hit his colleague instead, Andrew Honeyman, the Bishop of Orkney, who was killed instantly. A poisoned bullet? You just know that there's someone lobbying in the American Congress for the introduction of those bad boys coming to a Walmart near you soon. On the 3rd of May, 1679, Sharp, he was returning to St Andrews after a meeting of the Privy Council in Edinburgh. Sharp, he was travelling with his daughter Isabella and a handful of servants. His carriage, it was making its way through the Magus Moor outside of St Andrews when a group of men from the nearby village of Strathkinnis came galloping towards them. They attacked the carriage head on, knowing that bishops, they can only move diagonally. The ambushers, they were actually looking for William Carmichael, the Sheriff of Fife, the man who was responsible for the suppression of the conventicles in Fife. But now, to their great surprise, an even grander prize had fallen into their hands. None other than Archbishop Sharp, the man who, in the eyes of hardline Presbyterians, was the very embodiment of a traitor and a turncoat. Sharp was a former Presbyterian minister with a parish in Fife, in Creole, who had abandoned the covenant and was complicit in the implementation of an Episcopal church structure in Scotland. Sharp, in the eyes of the Covenanters, was a traitor who had cynically abandoned his religion and parishioners for the advancement of his career and the acceptance of a powerful position within the church. And he received a grisly death at the hands of the Conventiclers. In full view of his daughter, Sharp, he was pulled from his carriage and stabbed repeatedly in a frenzied attack. It was like getting the tube in London. The leader of the group, a local laird, John Balfour of Kinloch, said that he was encouraged by God himself to murder Sharp. It's mental how often God is constantly asking folk to murder other people on his behalf. Balfour and his men, who mostly consisted of local farmers, saw it as their divine duty to destroy the man that they believed was responsible for the suffering of the Covenanters since the Restoration. And their actions would prove to be the final straw, the catalyst that would finally spark the Covenanting rebellion that had been threatening and bubbling throughout the 1670s in Scotland. The brutal murder of Archbishop Sharp became a symbol for both sides. For the Covenanters, Sharp was obviously a Judas, but for the government, his brutal murder was the murder of a privy councillor, itself a capital offence. And their murder was, in their eyes, just one step away from regicide, a kind of king-killing warm-up, as it were. After the murder, Sharp's assailants fled to the relative security of the southwest of Scotland, where they joined a party of militant conventiclers led by Sir Robert Hamilton of Preston. On the 29th of May 1679, the King's birthday and the anniversary of the Restoration, around 80 armed conventiclers led by Hamilton rode into the royal borough of Rutherglen, where they made a flamboyant gesture of burning copies of all the acts of Parliament that they deemed oppressive and offensive to the Covenant. Burning acts that they don't like. I mean, I really hope that doesn't take off at this year's Edinburgh Fringe, because, this guy could be in some serious bother. They nailed to the town's Mercat cross their declaration and testimony, which laid out their grievances against the government and denounced every violation of the Covenant since the Restoration. And I personally think that more political parties should be doing this. They should be riding into town centres and nailing their manifestos to a cross with an accompanying bonfire. Well, I mean, except the Green Party, they probably wouldn't be into that. And the Labour Party, they wouldn't be able to put anything on the town cross because of their PPE contracts. They need to get a private contractor in to do it for them. And the Tories, of course, they would want the medieval town cross torn down and replaced with a high-rise building for Russian oligarchs. And the SNP, well, they simply wouldn't do anything, except maybe ask for permission to nail something up there in another generation or so. It is at this point in the story an important and decisive figure from 17th century Scottish history enters the scene. John Graham of Claverhouse. Claverhouse in 1679 was a 31-year-old professional royalist soldier who was called back from service in Europe to deal with the brewing Covenanting trouble in the southwest of Scotland. Claverhouse, he was a distant kinsman of James Graham the Great Montrose. He was raised to Viscount Dundee in 1688 and would come to be known affectionately by those of a Jacobite persuasion as Bonnie Dundee, on account of his good looks and dashing feats on the battlefield on behalf of the deposed King James VII and II. Claverhouse, he was a brilliant military tactician and leader who would ride into battle on his jet black horse called Satan. For the Jacobites, Claverhouse was the epitome of a debonair, swashbuckling cavalier. But for the Covenanters, Claverhouse was known as Bloody Clavers on account of his rigorous suppression of the conventicles, and for them, he would come to be a character who was despised every bit as much as, say, Archbishop James Sharp was. In 1679, Claverhouse, he rode north from Dumfries to deal with a huge conventicle that was gathering at Loudon Hill, the spot where Robert the Bruce had won a famous victory in 1307. The battle that ensued there is known as the Battle of Drumclog, named after the volcanic hump near the Loudon Hill. And it would be an impressive victory for the Conventiclers and their only victory in pitched battle against government troops in the Restoration period. On the 1st of June, Claverhouse, he came upon the Conventicle, which had around 1,500 armed men. The Conventiclers, they were led by a young divinity student on his holidays from St Andrews University, William Cleland, leading a rebellion on your holidays from uni. That's mightily impressive, man. It certainly puts my working in the Inverness Sports Direct into perspective. Cleland's army outnumbered Claverhouse's by 4-1, but it was comprised mostly of men armed with pikes and swords. Cleland, he arranged his men at the foot of the Loudon Hill in front of a peat bog, and Claverhouse, recognising a cavalry charge wouldn't work through the bog, he ordered his men off of their horses and to advance on Cleland's position. The Conventiclers then waded through the peat bog to meet the government dragoons head on, and in fierce close combat fighting, they were able to overpower the government troops. 36 government troops were killed on the day, and another 7 were taken prisoner by the Conventiclers. Claverhouse, he retreated to Glasgow where he had reinforcements, and he was followed to the city by the Conventiclers, who made it as far as the Gallowgate in the city's east end before being repelled by hastily erected makeshift barriers that were put up by government dragoons in the city to stop their advance into the city centre. Drumclog, it was an unprecedented and spectacular Covenanting victory that had almost resulted in the Conventiclers taking one of Scotland's most important cities. William Cleland, he was hailed as a hero. However, the high point of this rising, it didn't last long. Although, to be fair, the high point of risings, they rarely last that long. That's fairly standard, William. I wouldn't worry about that too much. The main thing is that everyone involved enjoyed themselves, regardless of how brief it was. Just weeks after their impressive victory at the Battle of Drumclog, the Conventiclers would suffer a decisive defeat at the Battle of Bothwell Brig, fought on the 22nd of June 1679, which we will cover on the next episode of the series. William Cleland, he fled to France in the aftermath of the Covenanters' defeat at Bothwell Brig, returning to Scotland in 1685 as part of the abortive invasion led by the Earl of Argyll. And after Argyll's invasion failed, Cleland, he escaped to Holland, finally returning to Scotland in 1688 as part of the Glorious Revolution. Now, just as had happened at Dunbar in 1650, it was bitter infighting amongst the Covenanters that would end up costing them dearly. And after the government would win their decisive victory at the Battle of Bothwell Brig, their approach to the Covenanters would not be one of accommodation as it had been in the 1670s, but of brutal oppression of the conventicles and the conventiclers. And it is this program of governmental covenanting suppression in the 1680s, remembered as the killing time, which we will cover on the next episode of the series. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode, folks. I do hope you enjoyed this episode all about the conventicles and the conventiclers of Scotland in the 1660s and 1670s. I hope you're enjoying the Mountebank History of Scotland series. And if you are, and you met me in real life, and you'd be like, do you know what, Daniel, I'm really enjoying your series. I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee or a pint of beer. You can do that digitally. I will leave links to my Ko-fi and Buy Me a Coffee accounts in the description on this video. Anything you give is really, really appreciated. It just goes towards the production costs of the YouTube series and the podcast. It really gives me a wee kick when people buy me a coffee on there. So thank you so much for doing that. If you are enjoying the series, please subscribe, like the videos, leave comments, help me kind of grow the channel if you can. Give me a wee follow on social media as well. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mountebank Scotland. I do like funny wee videos on Scottish history and put out stand-up clips and all that sort of stuff on there. The podcast version of the series is on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. At Mountebank History of Scotland. You can find it on there. And yeah, if you find yourself in the wonderful city of Edinburgh, I do a comedy walking tour of Edinburgh. It's called the Mountebank Comedy Walk of Edinburgh. I take people around the city, I show them the sights, I make them laugh. That's basically where the idea for the series came from. I also do a comedy whiskey tasting as well, where you get 4 malt whiskies from Scotland, and I talk you through the kind of history and the cultural significance of whiskey to Scotland and Scottish people. So if you're in Edinburgh and you'd like to join me for a tour or a whiskey tasting, just visit my website, mountebanktours.com. Again, I'll put the link in the description. And I always love meeting people on the tours who watch the series and listen to the podcast. So yeah, I think that's me plugged everything that I need to plug. I do hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. I hope that you're enjoying the series as well. And I'll see you all next time round. Cheerio! Bye-bye!